Hello and welcome back to The Walking Dead Retrospective, where today we'll be talking all things about the final part of the Governor arc, as well as the first leg of Season 4 in both the adaptation and the comic book. As you might expect, with how different the third season turned out in live action form, Season 4 will continue to diverge in many ways, and as such, we will be hopping around between the two versions quite a bit. But without further ado, let us dive in. As per usual, with the new season, we take a step back from the series itself and take a look at the external factors and community sentiment surrounding the series. First and foremost, coming off of the Season 3 finale, feelings were quite mixed as to where Season 4 might take us, as the Governor's story was still not complete and had a quite underwhelming initial attack. Andrea, one of the most important characters in the book, was dead, and the group had suddenly taken many more people from Woodbury, a thing that never happens in the books. Though more attentive viewers already began questioning whether these are budgeting decisions, and what that may mean for the story. Do take all of this with a grain of salt, as we have never really gotten concrete information about this, but a solid theory in the community back then was that the prison and Governor arc are being stretched out purely to squeeze more money out of the set. If you didn't know, the entire prison was built just for the show, so it does of course make sense to use it to its full potential, though it did mark the start of the endless budget debate. Again, don't take any of this as fact, but as far as we know, The Walking Dead has only ever had a budget of around $3-ish million per episode. Comparatively, Game of Thrones started with a $6 million budget per episode, and grew into over $10 million per episode. To be fair, HBO is a premium service, whereas AMC is just cable, so there is that. For now, just keep in mind this budgeting talk for when we get into the infamous bottle episodes later on. But with that being said, it wasn't all bad. In fact, many comic book readers were incredibly excited to see how the show may now remix the famous Governor story. And if you want to see just how different the Walking Dead community was back in old 2013, look at this excerpt from Reddit about the Season 3 finale post-episode discussion, where people are buzzing as to how interesting this approach seems, and praising this guy who happens to have written the episode Clear, the episode featuring Morgan in Season 3. Do you know who that guy is? That, my friends, is Scott Gimple. Oh, what a simpler time that was. If you know anything about the community now, you'll know that Gimple's name is almost forbidden. As to how I feel about it, well, you'll just have to wait and find out in later parts. But all of this is to say that both comic book folks as well as general TV audiences were of mixed emotions about the Governor's story not being over just yet. And so with that, we arrive at Comic-Con. Christmas for the Walking Dead fans, because it's here where we get the trailer. Retrospectively, I have to say I think this was the point at which I was most excited for any season of the show ever. As much as I love Negan, the Hunters, etc., coming off of the absolutely breakneck Season 3, I was buzzing with excitement about anything Walking Dead. As I've said before, I am of the opinion that adaptations can and should make changes if it makes for a better story. So despite, or maybe because of it going in a seemingly completely different direction, I was fully on board. And to be honest, I think this might just be one of the best trailers of the series. The way it lays out the premise is incredibly gripping, and that idea of the prison no longer being safe, not because of an outside threat, but something inside, is exactly what made the book so brilliant. And once again, I have to bring up the absolutely wonderful song choice here, that being Serpents by Sharon Van Etten. The song, mixed with the narration by Herschel, which we will also nerd out about, don't worry, and the desperation from the group is simply brilliant. No joke, when this trailer dropped, I think I must have watched it at least like 50 times. But lastly for the trailer, the post-credits scene of Sanctuary for All. This is one that had both me and the community absolutely stumped when we first heard it, because this was something that we had never seen in the book. And this isn't a small group, this is someone broadcasting a message. But for now, just keep in mind that we are going into the season anticipating quite a few changes already. In part because of how different Season 3 was, and in part because of how different this trailer was. And somewhat connected to the trailer, we also get the admittedly awesome poster showing that the fences of the prison would ultimately be breached. So even though the governor was nowhere to be seen in the trailer, for the comic readers it was fairly evident that he would be back in the first half. Okay, I may have brought this up just because I really like the poster, okay? And one last thing that I want to mention in the pre-season parts is a fun little theory that was circling in the community before Season 4 began. Now, I usually link sources for these sorts of things, but I couldn't find the original post, so I can only show you pictures. But there was a very dedicated group of people called Spoiling the Deads, which would frequent filming locations to, as the name implies, spoil the series. In the trailer, we saw these walkers with blood coming out of their eyes, and then we got news that the show was apparently shooting near the Yates power plant, and this led many to believe that we'd get some sort of radiation story a la Fallout. It's obviously nothing major, but this just goes to show that the community was fairly open to new possibilities, and theories as to how the story might be remixed were very widespread. But with that, we arrived at October 2013. Yet another spooky month, yet another Walking Dead season. To preface this entire thing, if you recall what we talked about in the Season 3 videos, that being the survivors just living in the prison, that is remixed for the adaptation and is pushed here. Some of the events that happened in that period of time in the book will be close to the live action version, but most are completely new. So put briefly, almost everything from episode 1 through 7 is basically exclusive to the adaptation. But with that, let us get into the premiere. We open the season with what may just be one of my favorite opening sequences. We get this very ominous scene of Rick walking down to the farm plots, with it being mostly quiet, and the only thing we hear is this old-timey country music. It immediately reinforces that idea we heard back in Season 3. He no longer views himself as the leader and is simply doing his job. That is, until he digs up a gun, taking out the earpiece and letting the walker groans flood in. Or in other words, returning to reality for a second, with a gun in his hand and the dead surrounding him. But again, he does not view himself as that person anymore. So he throws the gun away, puts back the earpiece, and returns to his own made-up world where he is just a simple farmer. I think all of this perfectly encapsulates Rick's character arc this season. That being him coming to terms that Lori's death was not his fault, and then re-emerging as the leader of the group. For most of Season 3, he never really got the time to properly deal with what happened to Lori, as they had to deal with what was going on with the governor, so now he has just put up walls for himself and wants to avoid making any decisions, because again, he blames himself. We'd also see this in the book, but more on that later. As for the rest of the group, they go to loot a local big spot, which is also where we see the introduction of Bob Stuckey. And his character is heavily remixed, as some of the details about his past are consistent between the book and the live action version, but literally everything else about him is vastly different. His character in the book actually lived in Woodbury, and after the death of Dr. Stevens, would be the one to patch up the governor after Michonne did all of the fun things to him. But that is all he ever does. He appears in like 3 issues and only ever gets a few lines of dialogue. In the live action version, he is obviously around for much longer and is a more fleshed out character in almost every sense. But the whole raiding a supermarket thing does actually happen in the book. If you recall when they raided the base and saw the tank, they do actually stop at a Walmart, so it happens during that long stretch of time between Rick escaping Woodbury and the governor's initial attack. The characters involved are also quite a bit different. In the book, it's Glenn, Andrea, Tyrese, Maggie, and Axel, whereas in the adaptation, there's Beth's boyfriend, who is of course a TV show exclusive, there's Sasha, who is also a TV show exclusive, Bob, who is also pretty much a TV show exclusive, and a few others of the main prison gang. So, all in all, it is still very different. On Rick's side of the story, he meets this woman who almost feeds him to her husband's zombified head, which is also where we get the 3 signature questions of how many walkers have you killed, how many people have you killed, and why. Though none of this, including the questions, ever happens in the book. But I do think the questions are a nice little ambiguous addition. Yes, it can be a little cheesy, but I still like it. Closing off the premiere, we get the catalyst for much of the first half story, that being the illness. Again, this is entirely exclusive to the adaptation. And keep in mind that the TV version took in the members of Woodbury, so there are a lot more people in the adaptation compared to the book. And before we get any further, I'm just going to preface this entire thing by saying that I absolutely loved this storyline. It obviously wouldn't have worked in the books because again, there were far less people in the prison, but in the live action version, due to it being uncharted territory in terms of story, and because of how genuinely terrifying it was, I think it brilliantly captured the darkness of the comic book prison arc. Of course, depending on when you're watching this, yes I know, right now talking about it is not really that exciting. But just try to avoid those associations is pretty much all I can say. But it's also at this point that we learn Michonne has spent the past months trying to track down the governor. This sort of happens in the book, but it is fundamentally different because instead of trying to find him, they just go after him following the first attack on the prison. So it's not really like tracking him down per se, it's literally just chasing him. Another notable event is the death of Mika and Lizzie's father. While their exact characters are TV show exclusive, as I said in the Season 3 video, think of them as Ben and Billy in the comics. In the adaptation, the 2 girls are adopted by Carol, who is of course no longer in the books. Similar to the book, Rick's leadership is also replaced by the Council, only in the adaptation we see more of it, and its composition is quite a bit different. It's not really worth getting into too much as Rick would quickly return to his leadership position anyway. However, Herschel is a part of it, and Herschel is cool, and if you disagree, you're wrong. Jokes aside, Season 4 does have quite a bit of focus on him as a character, and that pretty much starts here. And one thing to mention here, and I know this is going to sound absolutely ridiculous, some people genuinely believe that it's a plot hole that we see him walk around. So just in case I need to clear that up, there is a time skip between Season 3 and Season 4, during which they find a mechanical prosthetic which Herschel uses, similar to Dale in the comic book version. Yes, I know the fact that I had to say that is bizarre to say the least, but there it is. I've really seen people say this too many times. Anyway, moving on, another pressing issue in the live action version is how the walkers keep stacking up on the fence. This is a major part of how this season would play out, and surprise surprise, this never happens in the book. Though on this, I think it's worth taking a step back for a moment and having a bit of a meta discussion. I know a common criticism of the later seasons is that the walkers are nowhere near as important or dangerous as they are in the beginning. But the thing is, there are very long stretches of time in the comic, especially in the prison arc, where walkers really aren't a big deal either. For me, it's obviously always a thing in the background, but it comes and it goes. So for those of you who have read the books all the way through, what do you think of the importance of walkers later on in both versions? Do you think one handled it better than the other, or are they equal? But yes, the constant threat of walkers in Season 4 in particular is one of my favorite things about it, especially because it's not just a passive threat. It actually comes into play just a few episodes later. As for the illness arc, there are a few notable things here. Firstly, Carol, trying to contain it, burns Karen and David. This is obviously a far cry from her comic book counterparts and is what I view as the first step to the character she'd become. In short, now that she has gotten past her planned death in Season 3, a new arc begins for her. On the note of Karen, she was Tyrese's girlfriend at the time, and he happens to be the one who finds them, I guess you could say, very crispy. As you'd expect, he is overtaken by emotions and hits Rick while he's trying to calm him down, and a fight breaks out between them. Yes, this kind of happened in the book, but mostly it's just a fight between them, and the circumstances are much different. Both in terms of why the fight occurred, and the character of Tyrese is by default different in the adaptation. But front and center of this arc is Herschel. I know I've said this already, and I don't want to turn this video into another downer, but man, was Scott Wilson a fantastic actor. That speech he gives about how they are risking their lives every moment now, and that the only thing they can choose is what they're risking it for, still gives me massive chills to this very day. And keeping in mind that they had absolutely no source material for this, just wow. In story though, as a result of this whole thing, a group consisting of Tyrese, Bob, Michonne, and Daryl is put together to go get medical supplies. Obviously, this entire thing is exclusive to the adaption. The only somewhat common thing here is how Tyrese is overwhelmed by walkers and has to smash his way out with his hammer. A version of this happened in the comics where everyone thought he had been torn apart as well, only to discover him perfectly fine. But all in all, this is still mostly just a wink at the comic book people. And it's also here where we get the radio signal I talked about in the trailer, though for the time being, that pretty much ends there. Back at the prison, Rick and Carol also decide to go out searching for supplies, where they run into Sam and his girlfriend Anna. They're really not important. We ultimately find out that Anna was bitten and Sam goes missing. And we later learn that he had somehow ended up in Terminus alongside our main gang. As for the whole Rick sending Carol away, nothing close to this ever happens in the source material. Though I think the way it was handled in the show was simply brilliant, as it massively progressed both Rick's story this season as well as Carol's. For Rick, this was yet another reminder that, as Herschel says, Rick can be a farmer, but he can't just be a farmer. Sooner or later, he will have to do the things he's been trying to hide from again. Though for Carol, remember that in the adaptation, she has basically lost everything already. But instead of that breaking her, it simply made her more distant, which is why when she adopts Lizzie and Mika, she is extremely standoffish. And as such, once she is sent away, she just becomes more and more hardened. In a way, she is a good parallel to Rick. But unlike him, she's even more extreme in the sense that she doesn't have someone like Carl to protect first. Her interests lie only with the group. If her actions mean that the group will be better off, she will do it, no matter the cost. Whereas Rick would still prioritize Carl and Judith first, and only then the group as a whole. Back at the prison, we finally arrive at the brilliant Herschel focus episode, as he goes into the tombs trying to help the sick people recover. First off, and I know you expected this, Herschel's theme here, that being Oats in the Water by Ben Howard, is absolutely on point. Seeing Herschel desperately trying to keep spirits high in this situation that is clearly hopeless was so hard to watch. All the while grappling with his own beliefs, which are clearly a major part of his character and his arc this season. And the intensity of the entire thing, with both Sasha and Glenn being on the brink of death, was absolutely brutal. I could honestly go on about all the details in this single episode for hours, but all of this is to say that it still stands as one of my favorite events in the entire franchise. In my humble opinion, this Herschel-centric storyline far surpassed the source material, and captured the darkness that was toned down in the first half of the prison arc flawlessly. And again, considering every single thing that happens here is written from scratch for the adaptation is just wow. That is some great writing. And as if all of that wasn't enough, it's also in the same episode where we get another story going on in parallel. That being the walkers finally breaking through the fences. And side note here, am I the only one who absolutely loves nighttime shoots? Honestly, now that I think about it, most of my favorite episodes throughout the series take place during the nighttime. And this is most certainly one of them. We see Rick and Carl trying to put in some last-minute reinforcements as the fence is already caving in. But it is already too late and the walkers break through. And I've gotta say, at this point, I'd put the TV Carl ahead of his comic book counterparts. Due to the series having time skips and the fact that Chandler Riggs simply ages, in the adaptation he is far older than his source material counterparts and as such is a bit more capable as well. And so we get this absolutely awesome sequence of Rick and Carl getting a couple of rifles and having this last stand against this swarm of walkers. And again, if you recall what we talked about before, this is another example of walkers playing a much larger role in the live action version when compared to the books in the prison arc specifically. While there are a few instances of walkers somehow getting into the prison, it's never really on the scale of this. But either way, for me, it's just an awesome moment that reinforces the fact that we are still in a zombie apocalypse story, and seeing Rick fight side by side with Carl was honestly just really cool. And do keep in mind that all of this is spliced with Herschel's story in the tombs, so all in all, and I know I've said this a million times already, I think this is a perfect example of how to write quote-unquote filler, but still tell an absolutely brilliant story. And another side note, if you recall what we talked about last time about the series following the 1-8-9-16 formula, I'd argue this episode breaks that. Yes, the mid-season finale would of course be much larger in scope and actually have major character deaths, which this episode does not, but in terms of intensity and the events themselves, I'd still rank this one really high up there. Though moving on, following the bloodbath at the prison, the group finally returns with medicine and things are honestly looking up. That is, until we cut to a distant view of the outside fences as we pan over to see the governor. And just like that, a brief moment of hope is once again ripped away as we are shown that everything is only going to get worse, because the old governor has returned. Though before we see any more of the prison, we do of course get the 2 focus episodes on the governor showing what he has been up to since the first attack. And, big surprise, this is entirely exclusive to the TV adaptation. We won't go through the entire thing as most of the characters are very minor, but we will go over the highlights. Firstly, yes, the music. The governor's theme in this one, that being Last Pale Light in the West by Ben Nicholas, is an absolute banger. And as usual, I seriously recommend giving it a listen if you enjoy this type of music. I've had this one in my playlist for many years now. Next up, there's this little clever shot of the governor laying on a pillow that has a parrot on it, obviously hinting at his pirate-like appearance. Clearly it's nothing more than a funny little Easter egg, but I liked it. As for the characters, Lily is kind of a remix between multiple different characters from both the comic as well as the novels, but largely is just a live-action addition. But most notably Tara, a character who would become a pretty major part of the group later, is also a TV show exclusive. The events of these 2 episodes aren't really what I call the most thrilling thing ever, but I do think it was a very interesting look into just how different the live-action governor is and how he operates. Seeing him infiltrate this group and quickly turn them into his pawns was awesome, and is a prime reason why I've always championed a Walking Dead series where we follow the villains. Looking at you, Fear. But ultimately, they lead us straight to where we left off the prison, with him seeing Rick and Carl working on the farm. Only this time we see him walk further around and see Herschel and Michonne outside the fences, leading to them being captured. And notice how calm he goes about the whole thing. While he still hates Michonne in the TV version for taking his eye and putting his zombified daughter down, it's nowhere near the level of the source material for, I suppose, obvious reasons. But with that said, we have finally arrived at the mid-season finale, the climactic end of the Governor arc. Though before we continue the events of the series, let us finally pick up the book and see what's going on there. To catch you up on the events, since we've mostly only been talking about the adaptation, Just before the first attack begins, we get a very brief flashback of the governor putting together the attack on the prison. They drive up to the fences with no real plan, the attack falls apart fairly quickly, and they retreat. Following which, the survivors start prepping for his inevitable return. But opinions are split on whether it's even worth staying in the prison at all, and as such, we see Andrea, Dale, and a few others simply leave. Michonne and Tyrese, on the other hand, decide to follow the governor's trail and strike before he can. It begins fairly well, with them catching a few of them off guard, but Tyrese is ultimately captured and Michonne is sent running somewhere in the woods without her katana, as that too was taken. So, currently in the book, the prison has a lot less people there, as some left fearing another attack. Rick has just gotten back on his feet from being shot in the first attack, and Tyrese is taken prisoner by the governor. In the adaptation, on the other hand, since months have passed since the initial attack and they had actually searched Woodbury, no attack was ever expected. Also, instead of Tyrese, it's Herschel and Michonne who are both captured by the governor. So with that said, let us get into the attack itself, and since we are talking about the adaptation, let's start with that. The first and very notable thing is that in the show, the tank is not just for show. They actually use it. In fact, it is the very first thing to open this whole thing, as one of the towers is destroyed, signaling the attack. In the books, on the other hand, after they initially fell back, they just turn around and come back again, this time trying to use Tyrese to force them to leave. Again, the tank is purely for show. The immediate events following this are quite similar, though as we've seen many times already, where the comic book opted for a shocking death, the TV series leveraged the medium and emphasized the emotion. As such, in the book, there is very little build-up to Tyrese's death. One moment he's yelling for them to leave, the other he has already swung the sword. In the adaptation, on the other hand, we have the iconic speech from Rick about how they're not too far gone and that they can still come back from this. And there's even this split-second moment where you'd be forgiven for thinking that perhaps the governor may step down. But of course, he does not, as all sound cuts out and the only thing we hear is the word liar. Following these deaths, the battle begins straight away. In both versions, the tank tears through the fences, but in the live-action version, that is combined with it actually firing. Though there is a detail in the book that, to this day, I find sorta bizarre. We get this panel of Michonne sneaking up on the governor and having him at gunpoint, but somehow missing him. This has always been a thing that I've sort of been mixed on, as it always seemed a tad weird that she'd miss him at point-blank range. But I suppose you can explain it through her obviously running on pure adrenaline and just trying to get out of there while inflicting as much damage as she can. But in short, she gets her sword back and manages to flee. A major difference between the two, though, is that in the adaptation, Rick fights the governor hand to hand, while in the source material, Rick never even comes in talking range of him. Instead, they try to fight back as much as they can and simply run. But it's here where we get yet another instance of just how much more twisted the book is, as we see Rick, Carl, and Lori carrying Judith trying to flee, until suddenly both Lori and Judith are shot. There's a splash panel of this, which I can't show you for obvious reasons, but we see Rick seeing this for a split moment and just screaming to Carl to not look back. As we talked about, in the comic, many of the fighters in the prison had left before, so despite the governor's forces going in with little to no plan, they still just send the survivors scrambling. In the adaptation, on the other hand, it's more so the governor's forces are slowly taken out the further they get into the prison, and the primary reason why everybody is sent scrambling is all the walkers flooding the territory. But how can I not bring up the absolutely ridiculously brilliant scene that is Daryl lobbing a grenade down the barrel of a tank? You know you've got plot armor when you can take out a literal tank, right? Though, jokes aside, despite the prison being completely and utterly destroyed, in terms of numbers, the prison group clearly wins. In the comic, on the other hand, the governor's forces take over the courtyard and there's basically no one left who's fighting back. Though there is Herschel, who after seeing his son die has just given up and is just sitting there. He is promptly shot by the governor. Though he is suddenly interrupted by Lily, who screams at him after seeing that she had shot Lori and the baby. And just like that, despite winning the attack, the governor is shot by one of his own and thrown to the walkers. It's just a case of her being extremely angry over the governor making her do that to a baby. And from the survivor's point of view, that is the last we see of the prison. We just cut to Rick and Carl, where we get the iconic "don't look back, just keep walking," while the two of them are clearly in complete and utter shock. As for the adaptation, the governor is stabbed by Michonne to save Rick, and is later shot by Lily, though the circumstances here are obviously very different. Cutting to Rick, we see him stumble through the courtyard trying to find Carl, who is still there waiting for him. But once he asks about Judith, we see the seat empty. Now, based on the book, you can probably see why many people were convinced that Judith is indeed gone, and they just couldn't show that on TV. I mean, come on, it is a baby. As of now, we had much more evidence that she was indeed gone than her somehow being saved. So the primary theory was that, yes, that was the end of Judith. Though following this, almost exactly like the book, we get the same line from Rick to Carl about not looking back and to just keep walking. And with that is the governor arc wrapped up. Though if you were paying close attention, you will have noticed that the TV version actually only had two major character deaths, that being Herschel and Judith, since again, all signs were pointing to her not surviving. Retrospectively though, we know that that was only Herschel, right? And that's the big difference here. In the books, it's Tyrese, a character who's been around since issue 7, or in TV terms, like episode 3 of season 1, and has been Rick's right hand ever since. Then, it's obviously the biggest one, both Lori and Judith, which is just brutal, and is given absolutely no time to breathe since they just have to keep running. Then there's Axel, one of the inmates who had remained with the group. Then there's Patricia, Herschel's son Billy, which prompts Herschel to stay there and ultimately die as well. And finally there's Alice, who did admittedly just join the group. This should put into perspective just how worse the attack was in the books. And on top of that, how surprising Lori's death was when it was pushed all the way back to early season 3 and had absolutely nothing to do with the governor. But to put a nice bow on this entire thing for now, there is a thing that I want to pass on to you as a question as well. Most of what we saw in this half of the season was entirely exclusive to the adaption, and for me, that's perhaps what made it work so well. The large story beats still remain similar, of course. The governor still returns, he has his signature tank, etc. But the way we arrive there is vastly different. So again, this is a question that goes out to you. If you've read the books, how did you like the first half of the season in the context of knowing how these attacks went down in the source material? And if you haven't read the books, which version do you think works best after hearing the differences? The peaceful period of time happening straight after Rick escapes Woodbury, or as it's done in the adaptation, where the governor just goes missing for months? Do let me know what you think, as I am genuinely curious. Though with all that being said, in both versions as of now, the group is scattered and they are back on the road, which is where we will pick back up the story next time. And that's the video. Really hope you enjoyed this look back at season 4 as much as I did. It really is still one of my favorites. Also, side notes, I've had a few people ask about the frequency of these uploads. I try my best to have these out bi-weekly, but they really take a massive amount of time, so that is not a guarantee. Though as usual, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. Speaking of which, let us give a very warm welcomes to our newest member, Lunori Emera. I hope I didn't butcher that name. Seriously, thank you. And if you wish to join the highly coveted Mystery Shack Insiders Club, you can do so for as little as $1 per month and get access to all of the benefits. And last but not least, let us do the usual thing to see how many of you have stuck around until the very end. Leave a comment, whatever it may be, and include the words, "Tank Go Boom." Let's see what you come up with. Other than that, if you enjoyed the video, I'd really appreciate it if you did all the YouTube things to let the algorithm know. But now, I want to say thank you very much for watching, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.